Pozdrav dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Geoinženjering. Siguran sam da ste svi čuli o tome, međutim također ste čuli da postoje mnoge kontroverze. Stoga sam odlučio da vam dovedem nekoga koji je uistinu stručnjak, ko može objasniti u detalje kakva je razlika između onoga što neki tvrde da je kondenzat zraka ili onoga za koga neki tvrde da su u stvari chemtrailsi i koja je njihova funkcija. Stoga idemo odmah na stvar. Moj gost današnji je gospodin Daneom Wigingtonom. Hello, Mr. Wigington. Welcome to our show in Croatia.
Thank you very much, Andrija, for your courage in addressing this most dire issue in our skies.
Thank you. Well, tell me, who is Daneom Wigington?
I worked for Bechtel Power, the world's largest engineering firm, many years ago on some of the first solar power installations in the United States. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. I'm off-grid, solar, wind, and hydro, and that's what got me into this issue when I was losing extremely high amounts of solar power from whatever aircraft were emitting in our skies. I knew that could not be just condensation, and I began to test my rain, my precipitation, to see if there were climate engineering elements in my rain, and there were, starting with aluminum. Aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese. These are climate engineering elements. The more I tested the rain, the higher those elements, the level of those elements went. And as I began to research and finding mountains of data on geoengineering, climate engineering, stratospheric aerosol injection, the intentional objective of spraying light scattering particles into our skies for the stated purpose of blocking some of the sun's incoming thermal energy to slow down the warming of the planet. Clearly, these programs were, in fact, not just a proposal, but an ongoing reality. And the threat posed by these programs was so immense that I was faced with a choice in my life of going about my life as if this wasn't happening or focusing the rest of my life on fighting this issue, and that's what I chose to do.
Can you explain us what is exactly geoengineering?
It's the intentional manipulation of the planet's climate and life support systems by those who feel they have the right to do so, and that's governmental powers. And for people, and many in populations think that they would ask our permission or tell us before they did this, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And I would cite the examples of the detonation of 2,400 nuclear weapons to test them over many years. Did they ask public permission for that or anything else they do? They do it because they can, because the population is either too buried in their own troubles or own distractions to stand against this kind of tyranny. But again, this is a literal death sentence for the planet on top of a lot of other forms of human damage. This intentional intervention prevents the planet from responding on its own to the damage done. And this is important, there's nothing benevolent about these programs. They are not being done out of benevolent motives. They are malevolent. This is weather warfare, period. This is the controller's weapon of war, a weapon with which they can and are bringing populations to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault. They can blame it on nature, and that's what they're doing.
And who are they? Who is doing this?
They are those who print the money. So whatever elected official the public thinks represents them, those are just puppets in the play. All roads lead back to those who print the money. They control militaries, thus they control countries. And like, for example, the elections that are ongoing now in the US, nothing but mass distraction with puppets from both sides of the political fence used to create theater to distract the populations from the dire threats that we face. And that's all this is. It's all it's ever been. Those who print the money control it all. They control the media. They control the narrative. They control our skies, period.
What they want to achieve?
Control. Ultimately, it's all about control. So if we go back to the beginning of geoengineeringwatch.org, that is our website. We're the largest site in the world on this subject. We are non-political. We don't advertise. And the start of our weekly broadcast, which we pay for on 20 plus radio stations around the United States, The very first 30 seconds is film footage of former U.S. President Lyndon Johnson. I'm leading up to your question right now. In 1962, 62 years ago, on film and on the record, former U.S. president stating, "We had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, and he who controls the weather controls the world." That is their motive. So again, the demeanor of those in power, their mindset, their psychology, we're not dealing with sanity. No one sane would detonate 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the world and build thousands more, enough to exterminate humanity thousands of times over. And that's the mindset we're dealing with. So it's important the public understand that. Those in power do not have their best interest in mind, to say the least. And in fact, I would argue this: as the planet's life support systems break down, and they are breaking down very rapidly, the populations are not just expendable to those in power, but they're a rapidly increasing liability to those in power, especially in countries like the United States, where much of the population is armed. And that is certainly a liability to the power structure. If that population realizes what our government has done to them without their knowledge or consent, will they take to the streets with their proverbial pitchforks and torches? And I would argue, again, this is what the power structure is trying to stamp out. And whatever threat the population can hide from on the surface, we cannot hide from what they're spraying in our skies. So it is not only manipulating the weather, these elements are highly toxic, and they're toxic in and of themselves. When you combine them, they become much more toxic still. So we're all breathing this in. It's causing a massive downstream cascading effect of disease and degenerative neurological effects. And this is not speculation. Every person we test, hair, blood, urine, has these elements in them. And the longer this goes on, the worse it gets. It's being absorbed into our food, our water. It's destroying the ozone layer. This is converging catastrophes from so many directions connected to this issue.
Can you explain us what we see now in the picture? We see one plane, and there is some, he's spraying something behind. Can you explain us? What is it?
Okay, I'm not seeing the image that you're seeing, but when you see a dispersion, when you see any kind of lingering, spreading, anything behind a jet aircraft, it is in all likelihood a sprayed dispersion. It is not just jet exhaust. It is not condensation. Condensation does not behave like that. So let's look at the mechanics of all commercial carrier aircraft and all military tanker aircraft. All of them have what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted, meaning that engine is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances, and even then would be very, very short-lived. It doesn't spread out and scatter and cover the whole sky as what we see. And again, if anybody searches the term geoengineering, they'll find every single day about a dozen new articles on this subject, on this issue. They'll find the entire global climate science community saying that we need to do this immediately, to put jet aircraft in the sky, spray these particles, block the sun, as if it hasn't been ongoing for decades already. Again, this is a total facade pretending it's just a proposal. And they also will state that it will make our skies dirty, filthy white, exactly as they are. It will destroy the ozone layer exactly as it is. It will disrupt the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, exactly as has happened. And again, I'm not downplaying other forms of human damage to the planet. We've been very bad caretakers of this planet. But that being said, this intentional intervention for the purposes of power and control are making an already bad situation exponentially worse.
Tell me, which kind of chemicals is inside these planes? What they are spraying?
What we know of, again, what we've identified with hundreds of lab tests from all over the world: aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, surfactants. And this is if people have seen the rain looks like it's foaming, almost like there's soap in the rain. That's surfactants that are part of this mix. And their stated purpose is to keep the particles from coagulating, from sticking together and forming too big of a particle, which means it would drop out of the atmosphere too fast. So surfactants, We also have polymer fibers. That's important. We now have plastic. We have nanoplastics showing up in everyone tested, everywhere, in internal organs, in brain tissue, in our food. And again, it's not just decomposing plastics, which we recognize as real, but when polymer fibers are specifically named in climate engineering patents as part of that mix, and we know now they're showing up everywhere all over the globe, from the North Pole to the South Pole to the top of Mount Everest, of course we would connect that to these operations. We also have graphene. That's very important. What is graphene doing in our rain? We have our most recent 100 lab tests, with only a few exceptions, all had graphene in them. And we have climate engineering patents that specifically call for graphene to be used as an ice nucleating element. What does that mean? It means that they are chemically seeding our clouds to lower the cloud temperature, and it can actually produce frozen precipitation out of what should have been liquid precipitation. So when we see these radical temperature swings where it's far above freezing and suddenly drops down to frozen precipitation and snow with a flash freeze on the surface, it's called chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. Again, we're not guessing. If your listeners search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, they'll find all forms of major global media covered this, that the Chinese openly announced they were doing exactly what I described, engineering winter weather. But yet now, if you try to bring this up in America, you're marginalized, as if this is some sort of fringe subject with no proof behind it. So that's how they've tried to suppress this issue, is by marginalizing anyone who dares to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Tell me what they want to imitate. They want to imitate volcano. They want to increase albedo with imitation of volcano, well, to cool down the air or earth.
Correct. That is the stated purpose, and that is the stated example, to mimic the temporary toxic cooling effects of a volcanic eruption. But we now know from the most recent study that even with the volcanic eruption, the cooling effects are, again, temporary and toxic. Even a volcanic eruption damages the ozone layer. Geoengineering damages the ozone layer. In fact, the ozone layer is so damaged, and I want to state, without the ozone layer, life on Earth as we know it is over. And we are metering the UV radiation on the surface right now. It's extraordinarily high. We're getting UVC in the surface. That's a DNA damaging spectrum of UV radiation. And climate engineering and the radio frequency transmissions it also involves, we can talk about that later, is the single biggest form of ozone damage. So back to the volcano, even a volcanic eruption, temporary toxic cooling of the planet with many downstream effects, and after this temporary cooling, what follows? An even worse warming. So even their example for conducting these operations is completely flawed. And we know that these light scattering particles that can lower some daytime high temperatures also trap heat at night, meaning, again, the overall warming of the planet is made worse, not better. So the entire model, the example they use for conducting these operations is completely flawed. And then we're back to the point of then why are they doing this? It's power and control.
And this is they're calling stratospheric aerosol injections.
Yes, there's many names: stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement, solar radiation management, solar radiation mitigation. There's
sun dimming.
A number of names. Pardon me?
Sun dimming also.
Yes, correct.
Okay, that means this is a different names for the same thing.
Yes.
I have one, everybody's asking a logical question. How come that these pilots didn't come out and say what they're doing and go and become a whistleblowers?
Yeah, it's interesting people still ask that question. I know they do, but let's look at what happens to whistleblowers. We all know what happened to Julian Assange, what's still happening to Julian Assange. In the United States, the whistleblower who exposed the illegal U.S. military torture operations, illegal torture, of course, who's the only person to go to jail the whistleblower, the only one. Whistleblowers are absolutely crucified. They're made into examples. So we should not expect them to line up and sacrifice themselves to expose this. Also, we have compartmentalization. Many people involved with these operations do not know what they're about. They only know they're one little part of the puzzle. And so, again, between compartmentalization and the non-disclosure agreements, which we have now at this moment, we have an illegal federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration employees. That's an agency-wide gag order for all agency operations, which means they're not allowed to speak out about this. And I've had a NOAA scientist, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, say to my face, quote, "We all know this is going on. We have no First Amendment protection. We don't know what to do."
Which kind of planes they are using? Just military planes or also transportation planes?
Both. So we have film footage of, for example, military tankers, KC-10s, KC-135, C-17 Globemasters, but we also have commercial aircraft being used. We are not implicating commercial pilots or personnel. They would not be directly involved with these programs. There would be no reason to directly involve them. The systems are automated, but their aircraft are being used. We have film footage of these aircraft, nozzles visible, turning on and off. This is a sprayed dispersion. I want to stress that. This is not dirty jet exhaust. It's not condensation. These are patented processes with spraying operations within the aircraft. Our film dimming shows in great detail the diagrams of these patented processes. And some of these patents are very old. There's been aircraft spraying dispersion mechanisms for well over 100 years. And so this is not new technology. And again, when we have up-close photographs of the retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylon aimed into the exhaust jet stream, even on commercial aircraft, we have these photographs. There's no more speculation. This is a sprayed dispersion. And of course, they're not going to ask the public for their permission, because the moment when you interfere with the planet's climate system, every single climate disaster then becomes a potential liability for those in power. And to back up their efforts to make sure that they are kept immune from liability, we have documents at geoengineeringwatch.org, some of them hundreds of pages long, one in particular, a U.S. Senate document, 800 pages long, posted at geoengineeringwatch.org with the important parts highlighted. But within that document, it calls for intergovernmental cooperation, even between, quote, otherwise adversarial nations. For example, China, Russia, U.S., whatever their surface tensions and conflicts are, they are absolutely colluding and cooperating on this issue for their own reasons. And the document also calls for total blanket legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved in these programs for the reasons I already cited.
You want to say that there's a possibility that that pilots doesn't know if they are spraying something in the sky?
They should know. If they don't know, I'm not saying they're participating directly. That's what I'm saying. If they don't know, then they have their eyes wide shut. Many do know, because we're communicating with commercial pilots who know, and they're trying to very carefully and covertly raise awareness. We have mailed our printed materials. We have very effective printed materials, a 20-page fact and photo summary booklet on this issue. We mail those to some commercial pilots who leave them in pilot lunchrooms and other places to try to wake up the rest of their personnel. But just as is the case in the medical industrial complex community, we have practices ongoing that are clearly wrong, clearly doing harm, and yet we have the whole of that industry pretending it's, quote, safe and effective. So again, we have that type of willful blindness in society, within industries, and it's epidemic at this point. But the fact that this is going on in our skies is absolutely irrefutable for anyone who is willfully looking through, or willing to look through a clear lens. Let me say it that way.
I have another logical question. These people who are behind this, they also live in our Earth. They also have kids. They have friends. Are they exposing their families to the same poison that you are telling us?
Very, very important question. Thank you for asking. So let's look at examples we have of what they, again, ultimately those who print the money, what have they done to themselves already? I again cite the detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the planet. That has contaminated virtually everything, but yet they did it. If we look at Project Starfish Prime, that's US military covert operations detonating hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, and they had no idea how catastrophic the consequences would be, but they did it anyway. And we're still dealing with repercussions from those projects today. If we look at nuclear power plants, for example, Fukushima alone may be an extinction level event if other factors don't do the job first, which I would argue will be the case on the current course. We have Chernobyl that many people think is fixed now. It's not fixed. The sarcophagus is disintegrating. That's going to be a problem again soon. And we have 442 nuclear power stations all over the globe, and we're building 60 more right now. When societies all over the world collapse, and they will, what happens to those nuclear power plants? Because it takes 2 to 3 decades to cold shut them down. When no one's there, we're going to have Fukushima times several hundred, game over. What I'm stressing is that we're not dealing with sanity. We're dealing with power addicts. Do addicts care that their next fix might kill them? They don't care. They do it anyway. And if we look at psychoanalysis, and I'll finish with this, psychoanalysis of those in power, based on that field of study, there's a common thread with those who crave, covet, and seek power. And that is a, quote, near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves, just like an addict. We are not dealing with sanity.
That means they are responsible for some special events, what we are seeing, maybe some special climate events, what we are facing right now.
No question. There's no question about that. We can see their operations on satellite imagery. We know agricultural regions are absolutely being targeted. And let me back up and give a more specific example of targeting. Immediately after the 9/11 event in the United States, you remember that, in 2001, the 9/11 event, the buildings came down. Former NATO Supreme Commander General Wesley Clark was given a list of the Middle Eastern countries to be targeted. That list clearly existed before 9/11 even happened. After that point, every single one of those countries subsequently underwent a once-in-1,000-year drought. Their rain was cut off. Statistically, mathematically, that's impossible to have been a coincidence. And we have the leaders of those countries, in the case of Iran, on the floor of the United Nations stating NATO is cutting off our precipitation. And they know what's happening in their airspace and upstream from their airspace. This is weather warfare. This is unbridled weather warfare. And we have historical examples of this. We know in Vietnam, Project Popeye, the US military, was so successful at manipulating rain over Vietnam that by the 70s, international treaties were passed forbidding that kind of warfare, although no one pays attention to that. So this is, again, a weapon of war, period. We have examples of this. It's ongoing right now with killing crop production. And what happens when you do that? Population ends up in great difficulty. If they can't feed themselves, they're not worried about anything else but that. They become much easier to control and manipulate. And what happens when you're putting the kind of elements in the air that are now showing up in our food? We're all eating it, consuming it, it ends up in our bodies, it affects our cognitive ability, our ability to think, our health. That makes populations, again, much easier to manipulate and control. So this is a very complicated, multi-layered assault, and none of it bodes well for the fate of the human race.
I spoke with one doctor. She told me that endocrine disruptors are also in these chemicals. That means they want to disrupt our endocrine system and pollute us exactly to change our view. For example, we know that testosterone is very important for male, and it's very important for our future. But if we decrease testosterone, then we can achieve that people will not be ready for fight, or example, for asking a question, important questions.
I think you're exactly right. I completely agree with those conclusions. And all of these factors make that population far easier to control. And if from many directions, they are doing exactly that. And the one direction that we cannot hide from what's being dispersed into our skies. There's no place to hide from that. We have to breathe. And again, these elements are there. So whether a person chooses to believe such motives are real or not, the bottom line is there is no arguing it is happening. So again, it's like the weather warfare against the crops, the agricultural regions. We can debate the objectives and the agendas, but the fact that it's real and ongoing is not debatable. We can see it on satellite imagery. This is real, it's ongoing, and the immediacy of our situation cannot be overstated. If the planet's not allowed to respond on its own to the damage done, if the destruction to the ozone layer continues unabated, we are on a very, very short timeline. This is a very non-linear equation. We face imminent and immediate collapse on ecosystems all over the globe. It's happening right now. And those in power, again, see populations at this point as a rapidly increasing liability. They are trying to thin the herd, period.
You are in the United States and we are in Europe. We are seeing the same things in our sky. What is happening really in Europe? Because, you know, we are European Union, there's a different countries, some of them are in NATO, some not, but we see all these things all around Europe. Doesn't matter if they are member of NATO or not. How is possible, if they are doing this, how is possible they can do it? Is there any legal frame to do it?
No. And the African countries have just a week ago have shut down the attempt to gain approval for officially sanctioning these programs. It just happened. And what's problematic about that kind of news story is that it makes people think, oh, good, they won't do it now. They have been doing it for decades. They're going to keep doing it. And the fact that the African nations have not agreed to it is meaningless. It's still going to go on. So it gives people the false impression that something's being done about this when it isn't. We have legislation in the U.S. and a number of states. I'm personally communicating with legislatures from a number of U.S. states that are trying to pass legislation to prohibit these programs over their state. But the only benefit in doing this is to bring desperately needed awareness to this issue, that it's real, it's an immediate dire threat, because that type of legislation will not stop what they're doing. The U.S. Department of Defense categorizes this as a national security issue. They are not going to stop until they're made to stop by a public that takes to the streets and starts to look for and hold accountable legally and morally anyone and everyone involved in these programs. And that includes media. That includes those in the media that are helping to hide these programs. That includes the so-called meteorologists, so-called climate scientists that are denying these operations because their paychecks and pensions depend on them denying it. All of those people are culpable in this crime. Does that make sense?
Of course, they have to be involved, because I understand that Croatia doesn't have a power to control our sky. We just bought some airplanes, military aircrafts from France, and we're expecting them to come. But what, for example, France has a strong aircraft power, and how come they cannot control the sky? Are they also involved?
Well, they're certainly involved. All the NATO countries around the world are either actively or passively participating. Their governments are actively or passively participating. So if we look at the COP climate conferences, you may remember we just had COP 28, I believe in December, the Global Climate Conference. What are those conferences actually about? They're not about changing business as usual. No. What they're about is behind closed doors, pressuring nations to actively or passively participate in this insanity. That's what it's about. To keep business as usual until the moment of collapse. Because this current paradigm cannot function any other way than grinding up whatever's left of the planet's resources to sustain itself until there's nothing left. So these conferences are nothing but a facade. And in fact, what their primary purpose is for is to make behind closed doors agreements to continue expanding climate engineering operations and forcing nations to actively or passively participate. That's what they're about.
And there is a question. They are telling us in their climate policies that CO2 is responsible for global warming. I get deep in this subject and I see that sun is important, the most important part of global warming. And we can see here that they are focusing on sun. They want to dim. They want to increase this albedo. That means they are aware that sun is responsible for global warming.
This is where the equation becomes complex and very polarizing. And I would suggest that if anybody really wants to fight climate engineering, they will keep the focus of the discussion on climate engineering. And I would argue this, that and this is something that no one can rationally argue against, that there is no legitimate discussion of climate anything from any perspective without first and foremost addressing climate engineering operations. The rest of this equation is complex, and the gases that surround our planet are a part of the problem, but when you intentionally interfere with the planet's ability to compensate itself, now we have a much, much bigger problem. And again, the bottom line is, if we can expose and stop what's happening in our skies, we can sort the rest out after that, without this being a part of the equation. And again, when the climate engineering is poisoning soils, for example, in forests, the Amazon right now is completely disintegrating. And few people know that. The Amazon is literally imploding. We have boreal forests, which were an even bigger carbon sink, are no longer carbon sinks, they're carbon sources. Why? On a warming planet, and the planet is absolutely warming, people can argue about why all they want, it is warming rapidly. Climate engineering is a part of that problem. Not the only part, but a very big part. On a warming planet, you must have more overall rain. If you don't, because the atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. If you don't have more overall rain, then there's something they're not telling us. And that something is climate engineering. They are trying to reduce atmospheric relative humidity with these programs, and that is, again, problematic because it's a very myopic attempt. It's like the pharmaceutical cure for or treatment of the human body when you treat a symptom and you cause a host of downstream consequences that are far worse than what you're claiming to treat. So they are trying to reduce overall atmospheric relative humidity. So back to the carbon, back to the forest, back to the Earth's ability to absorb this. When they're poisoning soils with these elements, which kills soil microbiome, it affects root systems, the trees shut down nutrient uptake, they begin to die a slow, protracted death. They're affecting the water cycle. That's a problem. The ozone is now so damaged, it's bombarding the trees with intense UV radiation. So these huge potential compensating mechanisms of forests, tropical and boreal, are being systematically killed by climate engineering. And in the case of the massive epic fires all over the globe, that can be most directly linked to climate engineering again. Whatever the source of ignition for those fires, that's a completely separate subject. The bottom line factor is, what is establishing the conditions for those fires to burn with such ferocity? And that is absolutely climate engineering, period. And back to the premise for these programs of mimicking a volcano, that's what they're doing with forests. We found peer-reviewed study. We have the engineering wildfire section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. One of our most important videos is titled Wildfires Serve Geoengineering Agenda. They are intentionally incinerating boreal forests for the purpose of providing short-term temporary cooling. Is that not the definition of insanity? And we just saw this last summer over North America. You saw the Canadian fires, correct?
Correct.
I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of that. Almost 72,000 square miles burnt. That's bigger than the U.S. states of Georgia or Florida. That smoke bank, when it started, drift was manipulated down over the continental U.S. where it lowered temperatures up to 30 degrees. So yes, you can provide a temporary toxic cool down by filling the air with filth, but at what cost? You're destroying what's left of the planet's remaining life support systems. And we found peer-reviewed science study it's in the link I just cited, advocating for the burning, the intentional burning of forests to do exactly what I just described. A science study actually advocating for that. That's exactly what they're doing. So again, the totality of damage and consequence that's coming from climate engineering, it's difficult to comprehend.
That means that climate scientists are capable to explain lots of things in the atmosphere, with the sun, with CO2, with ozone, with oceans, but they don't put in equations geoengineering, and that's why everything is disrupted. They cannot find the right way or conclusion how they can solve the problem of global warming.
Again, you're exactly right. And this deception coming from the climate science community is criminal. I would argue it's absolutely criminal that they are continuing to deny this, and the public is going to find out, and they should think about that. We actually sued one scientist, Dr. Douglas McMartin. It was covered by Bloomberg News and other major outlets. And of course, the system sided with him. The system protects their own. But we actually took him to a legal conflict and trying to expose him because he censored our film, our groundbreaking film, The Dimming. I encourage your listeners to search and watch The Dimming. That's the most complete tutorial on this issue. But we have those that are so committed to the system that they will do anything to support themselves, their personal paradigm, their paychecks, their pensions. So honor, morality, virtue is not a part of this equation. And we have a whole segment of academia, and it's not just the climate science community. Let's look at the medical industrial community as well. Have they done any better? No. They are all towing the line for the matrix. But again, all of this, when we look at it in its totality, is leading us to very, very near-term planetary omnicide.
But there can be also connection between geoengineering and medical industry, because if they poisoning us, after that they can offer us a cure. That means they have good business model for that.
Yes, the disaster capitalists. And certainly that's a part of the equation. We have those that profit off disaster, and they are. But again, for how long will that be able to take place? And I would give this example as I have in the past. If you have pirates on the ship, on a sinking ship, filling their pockets with gold, how much good will that do them when the entire ship goes down? And that's exactly what's happening. But if we look at biological warfare, let's look at that component. As I mentioned earlier, we know we have polymer fibers in this mix being dispersed in our skies, and we have graphene. Both of those components are utilized by militaries as biological carrier platforms. That means to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground. We know we have the world's second most recognized geoengineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, a former U.S. Department of Defense scientist. We own the audio at geoengineeringwatch.org of him stating what he did. One of the things he did for the U.S. DoD was, quote, to design ways of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the populations below. We have Italian researchers who have identified CV19 connected to airborne particulates. And when we have the first outbreaks of COVID-19, we had 85 countries infected in 3 days. That's indicative of an airborne dispersion. Why would we think they're not doing this when they have a historical record of doing it? If we look at even coverage by a major U.S. newspaper, the Washington Post, who published on the record that even as of 1977, the U.S. military had conducted no less than 239 open-air biological tests on innocent, unknowing U.S. civilians. This is what they do. This is business as usual. Why would we think it's not going on now?
That means there's a possibility they can make a new pandemic with the spraying of new viruses that can produce it. For example, in this gain of function, what they already done it in the last pandemic.
Completely correct again. Any time they want. And they can do much worse than that. If they feel they're really losing control, that the public is waking up and the public is going to go looking for them to hold them legally and morally accountable, they can disperse something much more lethal like a hemorrhagic fever, Ebola, Marburg, and they can level the playing field overnight, anytime they want. That should be kept in mind.
I had the interview with Dr. Heiko Schilling, and he wrote the book. He explaining that the new pandemic will be with bacteria who will attack our microbiome. Is there a possibility maybe they can spray this bacteria with this technology, and then after that they can continue with the new pandemic and new plans what they have?
Of course. It's not only possible, I would at this point on the current course expect that to come. And if we look at what happens when you completely disrupt these microsystems on the planet, if we look in the forest, again, forest microbiome is all but dead. There's no decomposition on the forest floor. The entire microbial system has been annihilated. And we're seeing crop collapse right now. If we look at the whole global picture, if I can give a quick synopsis of how bad it is. Plankton population collapse. We have, yes, many factors affecting plankton. We poison the oceans. There's nuclear contamination. There's all these problems, and I admit to that. But what's the bigger problem that's not being addressed? The loss of the ozone layer, geoengineering, the biggest single factor destroying it. Now we have this intense UV radiation that's hitting the sea surface. Plankton have to feed in the upper layers of the water column. They're being fried by intense UV radiation and heat. So in the Atlantic, we have peer-reviewed study now to prove the plankton populations are down 90%. That's a crash. No plankton, no people. That's the biggest oxygen-producing source on the planet. And the other oceans aren't far behind. That's the base of the food chain for life on Earth. So now we're seeing fisheries collapse all over the globe. Global pelagic fish populations, the food fish, down 90% right now, today. Terrestrial and aquatic insect life down 80 to 90% right now, today. Crops are collapsing around the globe. The species extinction rate right now, today, is 15,000 times the background rate. That's 1.5 million of normal. Nothing normal about that. Bottom line, Earth's life support systems, the entire web of life, is collapsing right now. If we continue on this course, we're done. And again, I'm not saying if we stop climate engineering, our problems are over. That's not the case. You can't just undo the damage that's been done. But if we allow the planet to respond to the damage done, we could at least buy time. And that's worth fighting for.
One important thing, there will be lots of skeptics. And we show here just a few videos, your explanation. Is there any other proof they can read it? Concrete proof, for example, some court decision, or maybe some kind of other proof they can see that this is really happening. It's not just conspiracy theory.
Okay, I know those that use that term. I would argue the conspiracy theory term is the final fallback of the factless and the fearful. That's their programmed response. If people don't believe what they can see with their own eyes, there's nothing that I or you or anyone else can tell them to convince them. If they can't look up with any shred of common sense, and when they see an aircraft leaving a trail from horizon to horizon next to one leaving nothing at the same altitude, or a trail from horizon to horizon that suddenly shuts off, the plane doesn't fall out of the air. It's not that its engine stopped, its dispersion stopped. If they don't believe the photographs we have, clear up-close photographs of these nozzles mounted on the wing pylons, the long list of effects that are showing up from this that are documented as being an inevitability with these programs. Again, back to the visual proof we have of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible turning on and off. If they don't believe any of that, there's nothing we can tell them. And again, I would cite this, as the proverb goes, you can't wake someone up who's pretending to be asleep. And we have a whole lot of people in our societies pretending to be asleep. They don't want to know the truth, and that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I read one interesting sentence where they say there's a people who believe in some viruses they cannot see, but they don't believe in the spraying what they see with their own eyes. Well, for the end, can you say something to our audience, how we can protect against it? Is there any way we for sure inhale all of these things? Is there any way that we can temporarily protect ourselves before we became aware and before we act through government or other way to stop this thing?
Chelation is essential to keep these elements moving through our system so they don't build up as much. And there are many effective ways to chelate that can help this. I would recommend people talk to a nutritionalist for their own personal protocol on how to chelate these elements out of their system. And it's a constant process because we are constantly exposed. It's getting worse by the day. The total quantity of elements that's showing up in our test is getting worse, not better. So chelation is important, but it's also important to remember that we have to deal with this. This is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat. If we don't deal with it and the boat sinks, all other causes, all other concerns become moot points. So while we're chelating, while we're trying to maintain our health, it's important that we engage in this battle. And how do we move this fight forward? The only way forward is to reach a critical mass of awareness. If we can do that, if we can bring this issue to the surface, and I'm very grateful to you for your voice in helping with that, then we reach the families of those involved, military, in defense industry contractors who are involved with this. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, for example, are two. And if we can, again, bring this level of awareness to that point where those families realize that their family member is participating in their own demise, only then, only by bringing this to the surface, do we have any chance of actually stopping it. And when I started this battle over 20 years ago, no one listened to me. But along the way, as people, attorneys and people in the Air Force, we have 2 Air Force generals that acknowledge these programs in the film The Dimming. All that happened as the level of awareness grew, and they realized that they're fighting for their own lives also. That's the only way forward in this fight. And so all of us can and should participate in that. And the way you do that is by sharing credible data from a credible source. You don't just look at the sky and point and rant. You share credible data, credible images. And even though many will try to ignore that for the reasons we already discussed, ongoing events will force them to wake up soon, whether they like it or not. They will have no choice but to face this issue. So we need to plant those seeds of awareness and stoke those fires of awareness, bring this issue to the surface, and that's when we have a chance of making a difference.
And for the end, one of the credible data is your page, geoengineering.org. Is there any other page or sources that you can recommend?
No, and it's actually, this is very important. It's geoengineeringwatch.org. Because if they go to geoengineering.org is a pro-geoengineering website, one that pushes that. So we're geoengineeringwatch.org, and we don't affiliate with anyone else because we have not yet located any other source or site that we consider to be careful with credibility, which is essential in this fight. Only by standing on credible, solid ground can we move this fight forward, and we make every effort to do that at geoengineeringwatch.org. We try to be the go-to site for this issue. So we have extensive data there. It's a data repository. And again, people can share links with agricultural groups, military personnel, elected officials. The dimming is, again, the best overall tool we have available right now. And to share that link with people who need to know, once you've planted that seed, it will sprout eventually. They'll have no choice. So anyway, we'll continue to do our best to be that go-to source.
Thank you, Dan. It was really a pleasure. Continue with your work and fight, and I'll spread this word wide as possible.
It's a pleasure and an honor to connect as well, and I'm very grateful to you and your listeners for their willingness to face this issue. Thank you.
Evo, dragi narode, čuli ste. Dakle, svjedočili smo u zadnje vrijeme, naravno, tim tragovima po nebu. I čuli smo također neke stručnjake koji su se pojavili da nam objasne kako su to samo kondenzacijski tragovi. Na pitanje koje naravno ne možete postaviti, da li imate kakav dokaz za to da su to samo kondenzacijski tragovi, odgovor bi bio ne, imam samo pretpostavku. Imam samo uvjerenja i imam samo želju da možda nije tako ili sam možda plaćen da nekoga uvjeravam da je tako. Ono što mi možemo napraviti je možemo tražiti dokaze, tražiti sadržaj našeg zraka, vode, polja kao što ste čuli. Ako oni zaprašuju i polja, onda je sve to i na poljoprivrednim proizvodima. Također možemo dobiti dokaze da ti poljoprivredni proizvodi su ili čisti ili su kontaminirani. Ako su kontaminirane određenim kemikalijama, moramo znati koji je izvor tih kemikalija. Jer ako, na primjer, mi nemamo dovoljno veliku industriju koja ispušta ove kemikalije o kojima smo danas govorili, onda se oni ne mogu naći u našim poljoprivrednim proizvodima ili u našoj vodi ili u našoj travi ili bilo gdje u našem zraku. To je ono što trebamo tražiti od službenih organa, oni koji su zaduženi za naše javno zdravlje. Nažalost, vidjeli smo kako se brinu o našem javnom zdravlju u proteklom razdoblju u kome su uglavnom slušali preporuke drugih, a malo toga učinili sami svojim eksperimentima ili kontrolama. Svjedočili smo tome, a to sam i pisao, na primjer, naš Hrvatski zavod za javno zdravstvo, odnosno HALMED, Agencija za lijekove, nije prekontrolirala niti jedan komad cjepiva koji je došao u Hrvatsku, a tvrdili su nam da su sigurna i efikasna. I u ovom slučaju, gdje je naše zdravlje u pitanju, trebamo tražiti dokaze da ono što vidimo na nebu nisu kondenzacijski tragovi, odnosno da su kondenzacijski tragovi, da su stvari nešto što je normalno, a ne ovo o čemu smo mi danas razgovarali. To je izuzetno važna tema. Naravno da mainstream mediji to neće otvarati. Neće otvarati kao što ne žele otvoriti ništa što bi bilo moguće neugodno za nosioce odluka, vlast ili korporacije koji na tome dobro zarade, ali zato ću ja otvarati takve teme dokle god mogu. Pozivat ću goste koji smatram da su relevantni po tom pitanju i pozivat ću vas da sami provjerite, pogledate na stranice koje su vam preporučili, pročitate i uvjerite se. Nakon toga odlučite što ćete sa tim. Da li ćete podijeliti svojim prijateljima, da li ćete slušati one službenike koji kažu sve u redu, i trpiti ono što doživljavamo svakodnevno, a to je puno neugodnih pitanja na koje nemamo odgovore. Hvala vam lijepa na pažnji. Uskoro se vidimo u novoj epizodi Slobodnog.